It's hard to introduce Munir because he doesn't like CVs. Why don't you like CVs? You don't like CVs?
CV? Because it's very degrading. It reduces us to institutions and information that has nothing to do inside us.
Okay, so he doesn't like CVs, so I decided to tell you a few stories or anecdotes from my encounters with Munir. I think reflects some of his virtues. As for his vices, I will leave it to you to decide after this conversation. So I have known Munir since I was an undergrad in the late 90s at the American University of Beirut. I was invited by some common friends back then to meet Munir, who I was told was coming from Palestine. I honestly did not care what he did or who he was. Basically, I cared less about his CV. I wanted to meet him because he was coming from Palestine. It's like for my generation, like coming from Palestine to Lebanon was really something. So we used to say, so we can touch Palestine when we are touching Palestinian, coming from there. I remember I held my hands and didn't want to even touch the cup of tea, which my friends made fun of me after we shook hands, so I can feel the touch of Palestine for as long as possible. The meeting was about an idea Munir was one of the ideas that Munir had at that time, and it was Qalb al-Umur. I don't really remember much of that discussion, but I did work with our common friends on Qalb al-Umur. Despite my involvement in many other student writing projects at the time, this was special. There was no editing, no judgment about ideas, no adults who would decide what is to be said or done, as long as the group who is writing an issue dig into the heart of things, which is Qalb al-Umur in Arabic, or turn things upside down, maqlubi, so, which I really like too. So the other meaning of Qalb al-Umur. Maqlubi is a Palestinian dish, by the way, if you don't know. So I worked with different groups on developing around 8 issues. Like three of them were with children, adults, mixed ages, so many different topics. It was a really liberating experience for all the constraints and the judgment about what makes a piece of writing good to be published. All the contributors were owners of the magazine. It was then that myself and many others discovered a passion for writing the university couldn't get out of us. So virtue 1, Munir, the inspiring person, the one who really always gets the best out of people. So fast forward, I go to Boston, and I get to be invited to Munir's cottage. His son Tamer comes in. I was trying to be American, and since all the Americans the week before in Boston were asking me about my field, what I do, basically about my CV, I asked Tamer what he was doing. He said he was working on roofs. What is your field study? Again, I was trying to emulate what I heard, was asked before by Bostonians. So he said he never went to school and he doesn't have any area of specialization. Working in roofs means working in construction, and sometimes music, sometimes solar energy, all the things people learn when they aren't spending all their lives to do only one thing in schools. It was then when I took Munir seriously. I used to get angry about his advice to young people, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, not to care for school and do whatever they want. I thought he doesn't get the consequences of not going to school, no social mobility. I thought he was like most men around who preaches what they don't practice. But I realized that Munir was different. His own son was D or unschooled. You have to decide. And he was preaching what he practiced on his own son. Virtue 2, man of integrity. In 2000, when I finished my BA, I worked with Munir on the Arab Education Forum, another experiment in radical learning. After participating in those meetings we used to have as part of the forum, I rarely participate in conferences anymore, as they never live up to that early experience. There was something magical about the environment when you have professors from top universities, director of prestigious chain of schools, to someone working in a tiny village in the Upper Egypt, Salama Musa, and someone from the desert in Syria who sings and collects songs from the Syrian Iraqi desert and turn them into radical learning. All sitting together, discussing their own experiences in radical learning. No hierarchy, each person is appreciated for what they are doing, not which university they come from, or the scale of their work, or their areas of specialization, or virtue 3. Munir as a champion of real equality. Fast forward, I meet Munir 2 years ago in a meeting around neighboring as a radical form of learning, which I hope you will talk about, or I will make you talk about later. Munir is still the Munir I met almost 2 decades ago, with his passion, ideas, new experiences, and endless involvement with so many groups. We all joke that Munir will always be young. He never grows old. I think this is not a virtue of Munir, but the virtue of not working in institutions, or having bosses that cut your age in half, or deans asking you to get grants all the time. This is the best cosmetic to keep looking young. Don't work in universities in this day and age. I will leave it at this, and hopefully after the talk you can have your own stories about this conversation. And after the talk, I will share the vices of Munir that I know too well. Please join me in welcoming Munir to this conversation.
I have one. That was really a reminder of so many things that I almost forgot some of them, but I think it's good to be reminded. I think one of the things that are very important in learning is a true friendship. Without friendship, in my opinion, learning will always be not deep enough. And I think what now Mayssoun reminded me of is this friendship that really was for 22 years. And we learned a lot together and with other people. And friendship is very important. Having loving feelings is also very important in learning. If there is no loving feeling, no matter what happens, learning will always be, at the best, very superficial. And that's why I feel the best teachers for children are storytellers. But of course, right now, what they want is some diploma. Schools really ask for diplomas rather than for telling and engaging with children with stories that really help them see the world, understand the world, and their imagination is very activated. Anyway, I want to start with...
I will have to ask you.
Okay, so with your question, not with... You start the question.
Sorry, I give you triggers and then you can talk. Okay, so you want... Okay, so I want to start with the title of the talk, which is Radical Pedagogy in Palestine. And I know from last conversation that you have a real problem with the term pedagogy, not radical. So I wanted to ask you if it would be possible to start this conversation about your take on the terminology itself, and what would you prefer us to call it?
The story I read about, actually my sister pointed it out to me about a year ago, and the story about a person from England 500 years ago called William Tisdale. William Tisdale went to King Henry VIII and asked him, he said, when we go to church, we don't understand what the priests are saying. And what he discovered, this Tyndale, that he wanted to really translate the gospel to English that ordinary people, real people, not ordinary, real people understand. And King Henry VIII threatened him, if you do that, I will kill you. So Tyndale went to Germany. hid in Germany for 4 years, translated the gospel into English that is understandable by people, the language of people, because I can't really think of one word that Jesus, the Palestinian Jesus, mentioned that was difficult, that needed a translator, that needed a priest. So he spent 4 years and published the Bible, the gospel. And people really loved it, and they started really reading it without priests. King Henry ordered his people find him, find this. They found him, they brought him to London, and King Henry put him on a stick and burnt him. Now, I like the story because it really clarifies something that I always believed in, not always, since 1971, that it is language that is very important, which means you can control people by language and you can liberate people by language. You can control people by language if it comes from an authority that wants really to control. It becomes a liberating tool if people use the language with their own understanding of them, with their own meanings, and within context, and with action. So this is, I think, where I feel that with priests telling you what Jesus meant, that is pedagogy. And they were very good at it. They were really using methods to make people understand Jesus according to the church. And when Tisdale put it in language, living language, he has this belief that learning does not need a teacher. That learning about life does not need a teacher, does not need curriculum, does not need priests, does not need professionals at all. So this is really very related to the question, because since 1971 and my maybe Palestinian experience made me realize this, especially the 1967 war, when I was working in Birzeit and teaching mathematics in Birzeit, and the war took place and ended. We didn't understand at Birzeit, although we were teaching and we were considered, the highest intellectuals and all that garbage. So I was thinking, how come that we learned all of that, got all these degrees, and that we don't understand something so basic? Why the war took place, how it ended. So I felt that we really need to learn more about that. So that's when I started really thinking that education and learning are two different things. We need education in technical learning, in technical subjects. But we don't need education in learning about life, from life, and about what was always considered the purpose of learning, which is the path of wisdom. That is mathematics, the sciences, everything was to understand the world, to understand the cosmos, to understand the relationships, the interconnectedness of different aspects of life. So I felt that there is learning and there is pedagogy. To me, pedagogy became, in 1971, after the war, became a distraction for learning. For example, in pedagogy, you talk about the methods of teaching. How can you really transfer this knowledge in books, in theories, etc., to students, and then they can apply them to life. So life is not a start, it is an application of what academicians and scientists really produce as theories and concepts and so on. So I feel that pedagogy is a hindrance to learning because it really put us about how we can teach rather than opening up a space for us to learn. Now, the war was a first step, but my mother was the most important thing that happened in my life, where in 1976, I was at the peak of my teaching or as a math educator in Palestine, but also around the world. And some group, I don't know what, I forgot their name, they put me as one of the best 20 teachers and all of that nonsense. I don't know how they count, and how they really put that. But my mother, who was illiterate and making clothes, I discovered for the first time when I was 35 years old, although I lived with her all that time, that what she was doing was mathematics that I cannot understand nor do. Sewing clothes. Now, sewing clothes means a knowledge that deals with the most complex geometry. Women's bodies. I mean, imagine. I mean, I can make maybe a box from some material. But really to make a dress that fits the body of a woman without really knowing any theories, without curricula, without evaluation, without degrees, I was totally, really, that was the biggest, I would say, I refer to it as volcanic earthquake. It's earthquake because it shook the foundations. It was volcanic because it had all this lava that came out of that experience that really enriched me. It was very enriching. It helped me at the intellectual level that nothing that I really read or did that made me so aware of learning. So the only way I could explain it is that learning is a biological ability that doesn't need teaching, doesn't need curricula, doesn't need evaluation, doesn't need any of this. And that from 1976 until now, it was definitely the most, I would say, revolutionary, if I want to use the word, revolutionary event in my life that really helped me free myself from a lot of superstitions, modern superstitions. Now, at that time, I was still fond of Bertrand Russell. He was like my icon. And I read many of his books about society and about education and about mathematics. And I learned about his collaboration with Alfred North Whitehead and proving 1 + 1 = 2. And then I was working with students, children, and I asked them, 1 + 1 is equal to what? So they all look at me. I mean, this is like 7 years old, 8 years old, 6 years old. And they look at me, I mean, what is he asking? Something so simple. I mean, why doesn't ask? So, I mean, they didn't understand. But they said 2. I said, how did you know? I didn't tell you what is the first one. What is the second one? I didn't tell you what's the meaning of plus. And I didn't tell you what's the meaning of equal. All these are things that I didn't tell you what they mean. So how did you tell me the answer? Of course, it was difficult maybe, but so that I will explain myself, I always took an eyedropper with water in it, and I put 1 drop of water, and plus means put another drop of water on top of the first, and I said, how many? Here I put 1 drop plus 1 drop. How many drops do I get? I mean, they are confused. They say, yeah, 1 drop, but it is bigger. I said, okay, we'll put a 1 that is bigger. So we put a small 1 plus a small 1 and equal to big 1, but it's still 1. And that is amazing when you really tell it to that age group. because that age group is still not corrupted. And when you tell them, you really have to believe your eyes and not believe Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead. So, but the one person who really made me aware, I mean, I put Bertrand Russell in my mind was huge. The one who put him back into his real size was my mother. Because I said, Bertrand Russell never observed the mathematics that is in people's minds. He saw all that logical structure, construction, but he couldn't see, for example, the mathematics in somebody like my mother, who was illiterate. And to me, that was very liberating. And now, that liberation, which is really interesting, I was afraid to say it. It took me 8 years before I was able to write about it, to say it in public. And another 6 years when I published my first article about my mother's knowledge. And it is interesting that I published it in the Harvard Education Review, and they told me 11 groups in America stopped their subscription to the, because I basically not only wrote, I wrote about my mother in relation or in comparison with the Israeli hen and the Palestinian hen. The Palestinian hen can survive anywhere it goes. There is no problem. At that time, I realized that the Israeli hen has to be put in special places with special food, with lights 24 hours, so that they can produce eggs every day. And if they stop producing eggs in 2 or 3 days, they are dropped out of school, dropped out of that farm, and they replace them by new ones. I mean, that whole thing is so simple, yet it is so invisible. There are so many things that are in life. Really, there is something masterful about hiding what is simple. And exactly what Tyndale did, because the church really made Christ somebody who is like an academic that really needs to be translated into, to people in simple ways, in pedagogical ways, etc. Although, I mean, like my mother, I mean, I happen to be from a Christian family in Jerusalem, so my mother never read a word by Jesus. And if you ask her, what did Jesus say? She only knows 3 words. And that was enough. Love one another. That was her understanding of Christ. And to me, that is the best understanding that can really be. It's very simple. If people love one another, a lot of problems are solved.
Thank you. Okay. So we are.
But I didn't say what I choose as an alternative.
You can have a calling about learning, so it should be like radical learning.
Radical learning, radical learning. But I mean, I think we don't need to put radical.
Why?
There is no learning which is not radical. Because learning means something that you are aware of while you are learning without really calling it even learning. Because when you realize something, you understand something, you make sense of your life, then you are learning. And a conversation is the best kind of learning.
But we want to call it radical because we want to reclaim the word radical from prevent here. So we are going to call it radical learning for the rest of the conversation. Okay? Yes. Okay. So, so if I can just sum up, it seems that your aversion for the terminology pedagogy is related to the importance of like the mother, the context basically, or the roots as you call it in other places. So the importance of context or roots in any experiment in radical learning. So this will bring me to the second question or trigger for the conversation, which is like mainly how did the context of Palestine and colonization, settler colonialism, radicalize your views on learning itself? And you can tell stories in 5 minutes only.
The thing about the Palestinian experience in school, the first books that I studied up till the 9th grade were British. They were printed in England, in London. And I remember in the 9th grade, there was the book that I studied in mathematics. There was a chapter about shares and stocks. And most of the examples were about investing in India. I mean, I still have the book, and I can tell you many questions that I had really to solve, and I solved them, and I got hundreds every test, but I did not understand anything. Up till now, I don't know what a share is and what stocks is. I never really owned any, so I don't know practically what they mean. But I got hundreds, and the teacher at that time, I remember, he put me in front of the class, and he made the whole class clap, and I felt, you know, they said intelligent. What is intelligent about doing something that you don't understand? But you learn the trick. You learn the trick. So, so again, here learning is totally different from education. I was lucky that I went to a school that was not very serious. So we had so many things that are not considered serious. Like, I mean, the principal of the school would close the school every Saturday because our holidays were Friday and Sunday at that time, and take the whole school to walk in the hills and the valleys and the villages around Ramallah. So for 4 years, I know the surrounding of Ramallah and the villages and the name of the villages and the people in the villages, and we sit with the people and learn about many things, including, which I find today very fascinating, reading the newspaper in a village at that time, the villages that we visited. They will buy one copy, and somebody will bring it from Ramallah, and then in a coffee house or in the yard, a person will read the news, especially on the front page, and while he is reading, people are discussing. So it wasn't like reading and understanding by their own. So every news will be discussed and everybody will give their opinion about it. And I said, wow, what a learning experience. Now I say it. Then, of course, I thought that, oh, people have really to learn how to read. But now I understand that one person reading and everybody discussing what is being read is a learning experience that cannot be done when the 10 people who were there each read the newspaper and understood it on his own or on her own, but no discussion and no different views were presented. So that was the school I was in.
So, okay, maybe we start with the experiments you had in Palestine, the 3 experiments of radical learning. So I would like to start with the first one, which is in the 70s. Your experience with the math teachers and the Birzeit University. So I think that experiment, you say that it shaped your understanding of radical learning. Can you tell us a bit about the 70s in Palestine and your experiment with the math teacher at Birzeit, and what did radical learning at that time mean to you in the context of Palestine?
As a result of the war and my realization that I don't know anything about life. I never used my fingers and hands in anything. So learning and fingers have no connection. So the mind and reality are not connected except through illusions that are in textbooks. So the first thing that I did in 1971 was, with some friends, we started what we refer to as voluntary work movement in the West Bank. So what we did was meeting in one of the public libraries in Ramallah and Beirut and decide where to go on Friday and Saturday, Sunday, and work with people. That really was for 10 years, between 71 and 81. And it was such a, really rich experience in learning. At the same time, I was working with schools that decade. I was working with schools about what was known then contemporary mathematics that UNESCO really brought to the Arab world. So I found out that really, contemporary or not, it is still the same logic, and I did not like it. So I started some other ideas. Two ideas in particular was where one, I told students, you can every Thursday afternoon, you can meet in the schools, because I had an official job with the schools. You can meet in the schools and call it mathematics and science clubs. And the question was, yeah, but we don't have laboratories, we don't have libraries, we don't have, so how are we going to, where are we going to start? I said, knowledge starts with a question that you have, with something that you are really looking an answer for. And they were amazing, really very successful. But something very interesting, they were much more successful in girls' schools than in boys' schools. Usually boys have more distractions outside, and distractions that, like argile or something, you know. But so the clubs were so successful that the West Bank military governor called for me to go and see him. And one of the things that he said, but this is political math. I said, I don't understand. He said, no, you understand, and you better stop it. From now on, anyone who really wants to form a club in a school, math and science clubs, they have to take a permission from the military governor in the area. So I went to the students and I told them, now you can take the idea to your homes and do it at your home, because it doesn't need anything in the schools. So continue with that. But the idea again between learning and teaching. So these students were not taught what to do in these clubs. There was no supervisors who was telling them right and wrong. They really followed their own instincts, and they really did what they wanted to do. In Birzeit, realizing this and my mother's math, I suggested for Birzeit University at the time to have a course for entering freshman students in science, in the College of Science. And Birzeit was still naive enough to accept. Naive in the sense that they were not following this strict academic work, and they have to know, who are you to really design a course for entering? But they did accept it. And I called that course Mathematics in the Other Direction. And students loved it. Out of the teachers of Birzeit, we were about 12, only 2 others really wanted to teach it. So we were 3. And one visitor from Cornell University, the second year, was in Berzeit, and he loved the course, and he taught it in English for students who come from private schools. But the main idea of the course was that mathematics is not only to solve problems, not to prove theorems, as much as to see the hidden logic, the underlying logic in phenomena, the similarities between phenomena that are not seen by the eye, but seen by the inner structure in there. As I said, students loved it because at that time also the political situation was very active, and students started seeing that in relation to the political situation, and the similarities between a military governor and a teacher, because they both have the power to really ruin your life. If they want to ruin your life, they will, unless you do what they dictate to you. Anyway, I mean, I wrote in that paper, which you can really find it, in Oregon 2015. So I don't want to say anymore, but that was, for me, that decade was amazing. It was the most inspiring decade in my life. And I took that when I went in 81 to Harvard to study. I went with these few things, like my mother and others. And I really felt I had the power to be courageous enough to tell the committee that was responsible for my degree things that I wouldn't have done, I wouldn't have even thought of doing if I did not go through that decade in Palestine.
Okay, let's skip the 70s. We have the Intifada, and the Intifada opened so many ways for the Palestinian to experiment with what has been called popular education. I'm not going to ask you about the problem of popular education, but I want to ask you about your experiment at that time, which is Tamer. And if you can just focus on Tamer with the passport, to the reading passport, and the character of Nakhl al-Shibl, and link it to the Intifada and the struggle against the occupation. No ijtihad.
But before that, I want to say something about that Intifada, which I realized for the first time. You know, we always talk about free thought and free expression. That Intifada, there were several international conferences in Jerusalem itself, including people like Chomsky, who came and talked about the situation and closing universities and closing schools and all that thing in the first Intifada. Israel did not bother at all. Talk as much as you want, whatever you want to say. When young people started forming neighborhood committees. Neighborhood committees was very, spread so quickly in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, where in every neighborhood, some young people started meeting and taking care and managing what that neighborhood needs, whether in terms of education, medical help, planting in food so that people will eat from the local gardens. Israel could not tolerate that. So I was thinking, why would they tolerate people like Chomsky, but cannot tolerate people who are just working in the gardens and teaching children and playing with children and taking care of their elderly? And the only explanation is the medium was different. The medium in the case of conferences are people who talk for 2 hours, then everybody goes home, and that's the end of the talk. In the neighborhood committees, these young people are taking responsibility of what is happening in their neighborhood.
But now Israel is also doesn't allow people like Chomsky or anyone to get in.
No, yeah. But I was saying about the Intifada. The Intifada was very clear. They were tolerant of conferences, no matter how you cast Israel in the conference. From beginning to end, they don't bother. But when people stop talking freely, just free speech and free thinking, and they freed themselves from free talk and free thinking and started doing what they thought should be done. So their actions and the fact that they were not part of political parties, they were not part of an organization, but they were the medium of learning. They were the medium of taking care of themselves. That was what Israel could not tolerate. And that's what they banned them. They banned them, and anyone who does this kind of thing will be in prison. And they imprisoned many people. Jad Ishaq, who was teaching at the University of Bethlehem, was put in jail for 6 months, and they wanted to renew it. Then there were many Israelis who really knew him, and they put pressure, and they did not renew the 6 months. But all what he was involved in was communal farming, communal planting. I left Berzet beginning of '89, and I started what I called Tamer Institute, although it is an institute, but actually it is an institute only to get the permission to have it, but it wasn't anything to do with institutions. And the first or the biggest project we had was reading and expression campaign. And the reading was we made passports for reading, and 7 passports. So every child, after they finish the first one, they will go to the second one and so on, but they choose their books. And there is no evaluation of their reading or anything of that. By the time they finish the 7 passports, they would have read 150 books. And we thought that that is something as a basis to go on. And again, we never really give prizes. We never talked about whether they were doing a good job or not a good job. There was nothing like that. So the passport for reading, we didn't have any money for it. So what we did was selling the passport for very minimum, just to cover the expenses. And in 2 years, there were 100,000 passports that were sold, that were bought by children. Anyway, again, it is a long story that I wrote about also in the Harvard Education Review, the reading campaign in the Palestinian community. In addition to that, we opened a page in Al-Quds newspaper for people from 10 years old to 20 years old to write whatever they want. And we never corrected even their language. We wanted their language as we received it to put it in there. And again, within the 2 years, the first 2 years, about 1,000 children wrote. What is interesting also, 700 out of the 1,000 were women, were girls. But that, again, was something that Israel did not like, and eventually, when they opened schools, they thought that it's better to open schools than having this ability to learn without schools and without evaluation. So the reading campaign is still going up till today. It doesn't exactly have the same spirit, but it's still going on. But again, in the first Intifada, there was a lot of learning with no education, with no teaching, without evaluation, without any of these things. Oh, yeah, I forgot the other interesting aspect in there we had this wonderful guy from Jerusalem. He is a master in dealing with children, playing with children, making them happy, making them tell stories, etc. And he and a friend of his formed a character called Nakhle Shiber. Nakhle means a palm tree, which is very tall, and Shiber is this. So the idea is an expression of the contradictions in the Palestinian society. So the character is Nakhle Shiber. So he went to villages, and it's amazing. I mean, almost in every village that we went to, the children will come walking, receiving him, and walking with him. He usually comes with a small car, and it was a fascinating thing. Again, there are pictures even in that article in the Harvard Education Review about this character. The what? Yeah, she says I'm having propaganda for my articles, but I mean, because I don't have time to explain everything, you can at least look at that. So, but this idea of expression and reading, and at the same time, small groups were formed, and so there was conversation. These three things we thought are very crucial in learning, and that was the reading campaign.
Okay, because we are out of time, I really want to ask you about like the connection with other in struggles around the world. I know that you were involved at some point with Zapatista, Gustavo Esteva, and others in South Africa. So if you can tell us about a little bit of the connections in there, and then talk about like compare it to the anti-colonial movement before that, if you can.
Okay. My first connection with the Friends of Birzeit University was with Roger Owen. Roger Owen was teaching at the time at Oxford, and his field was the economy of mainly Egypt and the Levant, the Syrian countries. But he was, when Birzeit was closed, he was always like outspoken against the closure of schools and universities. So the first time that Israel closed universities, Birzeit University for 2 months, was in 1979. And so some people in Britain and some people in France invited me and invited an Israeli physicist from the Hebrew University, Danny Amit. And we both toured these two countries and spoke about the closure. And Roger Owen was one of these people that we met with in Oxford University. I mean, people like, if you know, Marcuse was very famous at the time. He wrote The One-Dimensional Man. He visited Birzeit. Ivan Illich visited Birzeit. Freire was supposed to visit Birzeit, but his wife died at the time and he couldn't. I mean, there were so many people, and Birzeit was at the time something like 500 students. At that time, there was interest in Birzeit because what Birzeit really represented as a first Palestinian university in modern history.